joining us this morning for our webinar on working with survivors of trauma. I'm Saba Big. I'm a supervising attorney here at the National Immigrant Justice Center, and I'll be doing my best to try to moderate our training this morning. Presenting today is Amanda Zelahowski, a licensed clinical and forensic psychologist and also an attorney. She's an assistant professor of psychology at Valparaiso University, where she also serves as a coordinator of the dual degree programs in law and psychology. She teaches a wide variety of courses, including ethics and professional development in psychology, and provides clinical supervision to grad students. Dr. Zelahowski's primary research interests include forensic and mental health assessment, at-risk, delinquent, and traumatized youth, child custody and child welfare, and the intersection of psychology, law, and public policy. She also conducts research related to best practices in teaching and training in the areas of psychology, law, and trauma. In addition to her teaching and research interests, Dr. Zelahowski conducts forensic and psychological evaluations, is a risk management consultant for the Trust, and has provided training and consultation to numerous mental health, law enforcement, and legal and correctional agencies. Dr. Zelahowski, why don't you take it away?
All right, thank you, and thank you very much for having me. It's a great privilege to be here and to get to talk to you about a topic that is very near and dear to my heart. So we're going to be talking about understanding trauma today and different considerations when working with victims of trauma and various adverse experiences. So before we get started, I just want to acknowledge a number of folks and the Trauma Center at Justice Resource Institute, Dr. Margaret Bostein, Dr. Elizabeth Hopper, and Cynthia Kennedy, all of whom contributed various components to this particular training. So I thank them for their assistance. So let's just start with what it is that we're talking about. What do we mean when we talk about trauma? There's lots of different ways to define it. There are legal definitions of what can constitute a traumatic experience, and certainly there are many definitions in the mental health and psychiatric communities. So probably the most common definition that we use is the one that comes from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM, which is currently in its 5th edition. And here is how that definition is stated. Exposure to death, threatened death, actual or threatened serious injury, or actual or threatened sexual violence as follows. And then it goes on to list a number of different areas and situations that could constitute a trauma. So there are various schools of thought around the definitions included in the DSM, and certainly some criticisms of adverse experiences that do not fall within this particular definition. And so it's important for us to remember that events are never traumatic just because they meet a threshold criterion or don't meet that particular criterion. And so in the work that you all do with various victims of different types of trauma and survivors of incredibly adverse experiences, just because a particular experience does not meet a certain definition doesn't necessarily mean the person didn't experience it as traumatic. And so it's important for us to be thinking about the individual's experience and perceptions. So I want to tease this out a little bit into different types of traumas. So we've got acute trauma and chronic trauma. So I'll distinguish between these in the way that we talk about them. So acute trauma is one that we are really familiar with, right? So something that typically happens one time, a single event, things like accidents, being exposed to a natural disaster, a tragic loss of a loved one, and a physical assault or sexual assault, for example. So these events are acute, as it says in their definition. You go through a variety of different feelings, thoughts, reactions that can then contribute to a broader sense of being overwhelmed. But this, again, is a traumatic situation that is limited in time and has happened once. So we distinguish that from a chronic trauma. And this happens in a couple different ways. A chronic trauma could be many of those acute events that are happening over a period of time in a sequence. So perhaps somebody's in a car accident, but then they're also involved in a domestic violence altercation, and so on and so forth. So they have a series of different events over a period of time. That's one type of chronic trauma. Then we also look at the more traditional definition of chronic, meaning long-standing, so happening over a long period of time where the same type of abuse, for example, is inflicted over a period of time. So things like physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, war, and lots of experiences of various immigrants and refugees would fall under this chronic trauma definition. So the effects of chronic trauma also tend to be cumulative. With each additional traumatic experience or event, it can bring up a lot of the effects of previous experiences that the individual has encountered. So let's talk about some of those situations, just from a classic perspective first. So here are examples of situations that can be traumatic for adults. So car accidents, terrorist attacks, domestic violence type situations, community violence, life-threatening illness of a caregiver. These are all situations we classically think of when we tend to think of something that is traumatic. And I just want to distinguish a bit between how children also experience things that we may not always think about as traumatic, because I know a lot of you are working with the whole family in these various situations. So here are some examples of situations that can be traumatic for kids. I'll just put them up and let you read through them. Some of them are certainly obvious, right, and similar to what we see with adults. So again, witnessing community violence, physical or sexual abuse, losing a loved one in a tragic way. But there are other situations that are traumatic for kids that we don't tend to think about as much. For example, now we're seeing lots of efforts and education and public health initiatives related to bullying, right, and working towards minimizing the effects of bullying and reducing the prevalence of bullying. But other things like seeing a parent get arrested, for example, or detained, that's hugely traumatic for kids and can be very confusing to understand this distinction between people who are supposed to be protecting you, like the police, that are then also inflicting harm from the child's perspective on the family by hauling off one of his or her parents. So just different things like this come up. Again, anything that has to do with threatening a caregiver, whether that's illness or legal situations or medical situations, all of those are things that could be considered traumatic for kids that we don't often pay as much attention to. So we've got these basic situations that can be the catalyst for a traumatic event or a traumatic experience. But then we also have to think about contextual factors. So what are other situations or sources of ongoing stress for people who are encountering these adverse experiences? These can be things like poverty, experiencing discrimination, being separated from loved ones, displacement or moving a lot, experiencing problems in school or in employment contexts for adults, loss, and then certainly the whole refugee or immigrant experience in itself is a constant source of ongoing stress. So you lay that on top of a number of these other traumatic incidents or events, and that really compounds the reactions or symptoms that somebody's showing, and also then for the work that you do makes it difficult to work with somebody who has these multiple layers. So one of the questions we get a lot, though, is, okay, if many people are going through the same type of situation, why aren't two people having the same experience? And why do we see some people have a much more traumatic experience or manifestations of that, and somebody else seem to appear more resilient or not experience the effects as severely? So one of the reasons that happens is because it depends on the different dimensions of their experience. So things like, what was the type of exposure they experienced? How old was the individual when they were exposed to some sort of traumatic event? Was this public or private? So was this something that happened within the confines of your home, or was this something for a child, for example, that the whole school knows about now that your parent was arrested or detained in some way, and now that's a very public shaming experience for that individual? How long did it go on? What other sorts of social supports or resources are present? Is there a strong connection of family or community individuals that are involved in that person's life? And what other vulnerabilities are present? So if you have any particular medical issues or emotional or behavioral issues or just other things that cause you to be vulnerable, then that can further exacerbate your experience of that trauma. So, and then add on top of that, obviously, our individual differences. So what's your temperament like? What sort of coping styles have you learned culturally? Again, what areas of support, and that could just include emotional support, are available? So let's talk a little bit about that. How do people cope with trauma in different ways? So one of the ways when we think about people who've experienced pretty pervasive trauma is that they sort of move through the world in different ways. One of those is to constantly assume that they are in danger. And so when your perception of your life and everything around you is a constant source of danger, you move through the world differently. You're constantly having to be vigilant. That's a heightened level of stress all of the time for you. And that can just be exhausting if you think about having to constantly operate in this way of assuming that the world is a dangerous place and that people are there to harm you. So because of that, you're always ready to mobilize. It's sort of like if you imagine ever walking in maybe what you perceive as a dangerous area late at night alone, and you're constantly kind of looking over your shoulder and making sure you're aware of your surroundings and you're ready to act in the face of danger. That's what a lot of people who've experienced pervasive trauma are feeling like all of the time. So you're always in this self-protective stance. And then because of that, you have to develop alternative strategies to get your needs met. So if there are different things that you need, if you need attention or the security of relationships, but that's not something that's present to you in your world, you find different ways to get what you need. And sometimes we find really what we might consider negative coping strategies. But for that person, it really is about survival. So when we think about some of these assumptions and how you come into these meetings with your clients and you're trying to have these conversations, think about it from their perspective and their lens. So a common assumption, again, is I'm not safe. People want to hurt me. The world is dangerous. If I'm in danger, there's nobody there to help. I'm not worth people helping me, and it will never get better. And so if this is the way somebody is encountering their life and thinking about how it is that they're supposed to function each day, of course it's difficult for them to work with you and think about things like the long term and planning for the future and next steps and all of those things when you're not even really sure that you're going to be able to get through the day. It's really about basic survival instincts at that point. And so I think it's helpful when I've worked with people with pervasive trauma backgrounds like your clients to understand a little bit of the lens that they are viewing their work with you through. So other things that we need to be aware of are what can we do that makes it worse for them, right? We don't want to be re-traumatizing people when they've already been through enough. And so one of the things that you can do to help is to just be aware of what might be triggers for people. So a trigger is anything that can remind you of a traumatic experience. So it can lead to lots of different things that the person does to cope with that, but you just might not be aware that something is a trigger. So there are different types of triggers. It could be something internal, so a physical sensation. It could be something like while you're sitting and talking with a client, they feel somebody walk up behind them, and that causes them to sort of tense up and turn around really quickly because they just feel that physical sensation of somebody looming right behind them. It can be something external. Being in a crowd, some sort of smell that reminds them of a situation that was really traumatic for them, loud sounds, or just seeing something like what they perceive to be a very angry face. Does that mean I'm about to be assaulted because this person is making that expression? And it can also be a combination of these things. So maybe they have an interaction with somebody that they then feel vulnerable in some way or trapped in some way and so have a reaction to. So it's important to remember that triggers are not always obvious. And if you see somebody sort of tensing up or changing their reaction seemingly pretty suddenly, just check in with them and say, you know, are you doing okay? Did something startle you? Is there something about this room that's uncomfortable for you? We can move. You know, giving them options and control over a situation is really key. Which leads me to some of the really common triggers. One of those is a lack of power or control. So when people feel, remember that most of these traumatic situations are losing control in some way. Somebody took control away from you when they assaulted you, or when they locked you up in a detention facility, or when they removed your children. So you have lost control over aspects of your life, and that underpins many, many traumatic events. So again, when you feel like you might not have control in a situation, that can be a trigger reminding you of many different other traumatic situations. Any sort of unexpected change. Of course, your clients are dealing with constant unexpected change and lots of fluctuation in being able to anticipate what's coming next. So that can be a trigger when there's been even something as simple as a change in time. You know, okay, our hearing was supposed to be at this time, well, they're delaying us for 2 hours, and so if I'm somebody who really needs that predictability and control because that's been taken away in a lot of ways, even something as little as changing a schedule can trigger somebody to, this is not what we talked about, this is not what we planned for, and that can feel threatening. Feeling threatened or attacked, the legal world can be very adversarial. So when there are situations where people are talking in very adversarial or confrontational voices, that can be triggering to people who have had lots of experiences of feeling threatened. Feeling vulnerable or frightened is a trigger, anything that makes somebody feel that, and feeling shame. Shame can be a big trigger, and sometimes we don't even realize that we're doing things that are making somebody experience shame or embarrassment in some way. So just, again, important things to remember. So when somebody feels triggered in some way, I want to talk a little bit about what the common response can be. So when we look at our human stress systems, again, remember how I said that just because something doesn't meet the definition of a trauma doesn't mean that it wasn't traumatic for that person. So perception is much more important than reality. If somebody's experiencing something, again, it's feeling threatening or traumatic to them, then that's important for us to pay attention to. So as humans, we're primed to survive. And so when we feel in danger or we feel triggered in some way by some of those examples I gave, then we are primed to immediately go into survival mode, which means that a lot of our higher order functioning of our brains shut down because we just have to focus on survival. So when we perceive a threat, the activation of your survival centers, the survival part of your brain, kicks into gear because you're sensing that there's danger. What can then happen is an activation of a fight, flight, or freeze response, which I'll talk more about in a second. And we have those heightened levels of arousal, that vigilance or that need to be constantly aware of our surroundings. So when this happens, when your brain goes into the survival mode, a lot of times these other non-essential tasks cognitively get shut down, so that higher level thinking. So things like being able to reason or plan, decision making, sometimes thinking rationally and weighing pros and cons, all of those things that we do are this higher order executive functioning capacity of our brain. We're just not able to do that when we perceive a grave danger. So then, as I said, you might kick into this fight, flight, or freeze mode. So when we're in the fight mode, what we're talking about there is feeling very hyper-aroused. So you're sort of mobilizing to respond to that danger, and that might mean you act out aggressively, you're very irritable, or you're displaying this sort of heightened hyper behavior in response to that threat. For other people, sometimes they go into flight mode. And so when you flee, what that can look like is sometimes withdrawal. So retreating into yourself, avoiding people, seeking solitude, not wanting to engage with other people in any way. That can be that sort of constriction, or excuse me, that withdrawal and wanting to avoid whatever the threat might be. A less common response that we don't tend to talk about as much is the freeze mode. And this is something that we see really commonly for victims of trauma. So this is when you see a constriction or a sort of shutting down. This is when people become really numb. They're just not responding. They might appear to be ignoring you or tuning you out or just looking completely dazed or spacey. The other way we can kind of see this play out is this overcompliance. So somebody who's just going along with everything you're saying, but really you're concerned that they're not internalizing what you're saying or really sort of getting what you're talking about, and they're just agreeing with you and saying, yes, yes, I'll do that, okay. But maybe what's happened internally for them is that they've completely shut down and they're in this freeze mode. This is one where you will hear people talk about, being really frustrated after a traumatic situation and saying, I don't understand why I didn't do anything. I don't understand why I didn't run away or why I didn't fight back. I just froze. I was like a deer in headlights. And it's actually a really common response to some of these traumatic situations. And so it can be very normalizing and reassuring for people when you help them understand, well, this is why you did that. Your brain kicked into the survival mode, and that's what you needed to do to help you survive in that moment, was to freeze and shut down that way. And that's a common response. So it makes people feel, in a sense, have a better understanding of, okay, it wasn't like I made a decision to not do anything. It was literally my brain trying to protect me in that particular moment. So we see, you can see there a great variability in the types of responses somebody might have in the face of a traumatic situation, that fight, that flight, or that freeze response. And so you see this span of different kinds of reactions in the folks that you work with, and it helps us just get a sense of why that might be happening. So those are different ways of coping. So now what about our role? How do we start to think about the work that we're doing with survivors? And I use that word intentionally. I really believe that the language we use can make a huge difference. And so in this work, and particularly in trauma work, we tend to talk a lot about victims. And I really think changing our vernacular and using terms like survivors, working with people who have survived this, can actually make a big difference for people to start to view themselves in a different way as well. So I think the more intentional we can be about our language in less of a sort of victimized way, even though the legal system and the legal definitions aren't necessarily set up that way, in the work that we do with survivors, it can make a big difference in how people perceive themselves and their own role in all of this process. So when we think about survivors, the way that people cope as a survivor depends a lot on their experiences following the traumatic event. And so in your role as a legal representative or assistant in some way with this process, you're in a really unique position to help people cope with that trauma, to help them start to restore that sense of security and to take back some control over aspects of their lives, which is hugely important to somebody's journey as a survivor and their ability to move on and start to build more resources in their lives. So I really think, and a lot of the work that has been done in this area, is that it can boil down to 3 different primary needs that survivors have. The first is to feel safe, the second is to express their emotions, and the third is to know what's coming next. These are all things that we can do. I think a lot of times in the face of working with somebody who's had such a horrific experience, we can feel helpless. Well, there's nothing I can do at this point to help with these aspects. But yes, you can. And so there are ways that you can help them meet all 3 of these primary needs. So let's start, excuse me, with the first one, to feel safe. So some things to remember we'll talk about for each of these, and then some specific concrete steps that you can take and things that you can do. So it's important to remember that people often feel helpless, vulnerable, and frightened after the trauma and after being victimized in some way. So remembering those helpless, vulnerable feelings, what can you do to respond to that? You can introduce yourself by your name and your title. You can explain your role and purpose, reassuring people of their safety and your concern and that you're going to do whatever you can to help them continue to be safe. Pay close attention to your words, mannerisms, and tone of voice. So if you think back to some of those triggers I talked about, you might not realize, again, that some terms that you're using, maybe the way that you're talking, the tone of your voice, or how loud you're speaking can be a trigger for somebody. So really watch those nonverbal behaviors that you're getting in response to your communication. Of course, if somebody needs medical attention, that's a primary basic need, and they're not going to be able to engage in any sort of other, again, higher level or cognitive discussion with you if somebody has a really serious medical need. Offering to contact family members, friends, counselors, that can also help in the process. Whenever possible, ensuring privacy when you're talking with people in a place where people feel, where survivors feel safe can help. Now, again, all of these things I also know that I'm saying are not always possible, given the constraints of the situation that you're in, where you're interviewing people. But again, as much as you can, try to keep these things in mind. It can be helpful. When possible, making sure people know that the things they talk about with you will be kept confidential. Now, of course, that's not always possible. There's aspects of their stories and their narratives you have to include in the different documents you're preparing. But when things can be confidential, it's really great to strive for that and to reassure them what will be kept confidential and what won't. Asking simple questions that allow people to regain control. So again, remembering that much of trauma has to do with losing control. When you can give people choice, well, would you rather meet at this time or at this time? What's going to be easier for you? Even little choices like that. Is it going to be more helpful if we meet in this setting or that setting? These are the 5 things we have to talk about. What do you want to start with? Again, just gives them little semblances of control that can make a big difference. Any special concerns they have. So sometimes we forget to ask the questions that we don't realize we should be asking. So you might have gone through your whole interview, gathered all the information you need for your narrative, and it can be a really important part of that, again, because survivors want to be so compliant, to say, is there anything I haven't asked you that you think is really important for me to know? Sometimes, of course, we can't know what we don't know, and so we don't always ask the right questions, and so asking them what they feel is important for us to know can also be really helpful. And then, of course, before you leave, providing them with resources for accessing support. So there are many concerns in these individuals' lives beyond just their legal hearing. Things as basic as, putting food on the table or getting a ride or knowing what comes next in the day. So whatever resources we can provide or access to resources or information for where they can access resources can be really helpful. Okay? All right, so the second need was to express their emotions. And so just some reminders. Survivors need to talk about their emotions and often want to talk about their story after what's happened. They also need to have their feelings accepted and not judged. So they'll say, well, I'm not sure I'm supposed to feel this way, or, you know, this might not be what you're looking for. But so reassuring people that there's no right or wrong way to feel after any of these adverse experiences. And remembering that sometimes emotional distress shows up in what we might perceive as strange ways, that people might laugh when they're feeling really nervous or uncomfortable, and that it's just the way that they express a particularly uncomfortable emotion. Sometimes people feel rage, and that can be directed at you. And they're frustrated with the situation, they're frustrated with the process, and that can be turned toward you, the person trying to help them. And so it's important to remember not to take that personally, but that this person's just experiencing so much distress that sometimes that's misdirected anger. So what can you do in these situations? Give people the time and space to express their emotions the way they need to. Sometimes just letting them have those first few minutes to kind of express what's most on their hearts or minds can really then help them calm down a bit to then get to the information that you really need to get to. Noticing body language, I talked about that already a little bit, to just kind of attune to where they are and monitor when somebody's feeling fatigued or distressed, maybe because of what you're talking about or how you're asking questions. Assuring them that their emotional reactions are not uncommon. Make sure to counter any self-blame. You tend to see a lot of self-blame. Well, I should have done it this way, or I should have tried to do it this way. And so again, reassuring people that there's not necessarily a right or a wrong way to navigate these experiences that they've had. Talk to people as individuals, not as part of a broader class or group. Not all trauma survivors are the same, and so it's important to remember that. Asking open-ended questions. Of course, active listening skills are really key, and including things like not interrupting or repeating what you think they heard them say. So, for example, saying something like, okay, so if I'm understanding you right, what I think you're suggesting is such and such, or if I'm understanding the way you described what happened, it was like this. Is that right? Making sure that you truly understood the way that they expressed it. And this can be particularly the case when you have interpreters part of that conversation. So the third need is to know what comes next. Again, some reminders. Survivors tend to have lots of concerns about their own role in the legal proceedings, and this is where you can provide a lot of information, as much as possible. They may also be concerned about media attention, or how am I going to pay for health care, or what if there was some sort of damage that happened or something that I'm going to be expected to cover. So just any predictability that you can give them can make a huge difference. So this is what's going to come next. This is when they're going to ask you this kind of question, and really just preparing people for what to expect can relieve a lot of anxiety and help them to, again, adequately assist you in the process. So some more tips on what you can do. Explaining legal procedures and schedules, talking to them about other people who might interview them, helping prepare them for that. There's going to be a law enforcement officer that talks to you, or there's going to be another individual or colleague of mine that's going to come interview you, and here's what that's going to look like. Sometimes they have to go through a medical or psychological examination to establish a certain level of trauma, for example. So again, explaining to them what that evaluation will look like and what their particular role is. And this goes to what I talked about related to that freeze response, helping to normalize experiences that they're having, explaining that lots of people in your situation tend to have difficulty remembering aspects of what happened to them, or remembering details, or experiencing some of these other symptoms, that's pretty common. Again, providing as much information as you can, and always providing room to ask whether they have any questions at various stages through the process, or when they need to take breaks, or again, giving back some aspects of control to an individual who lost a lot of that ability. So those are our three primary things to remember that trauma survivors need. So I want to layer one more piece on top of this, which is factoring in cultural considerations. So we know now from lots and lots of research that people tend to differ in a number of different ways when it comes to some of these traumatic reactions. So they tend to differ depending on their cultural experiences or the geographic region from which they come, how they experience pain, what they consider to be a symptom, if something even is a symptom of a broader emotional or behavioral or psychological issue, how they communicate about that pain, what causes emotional struggles, how they feel about authority figures or helpers, and then what sort of treatments they might expect to come from this. So people emphasize life transitions differently, they emphasize various mental health concerns differently, and sometimes you'll find that cultural experiences might be, no, we don't talk about this. I'm not here to talk to you about what's happened. And so when a part of your legal case is specifically having to establish that they've been traumatized or experienced severe trauma, it can be very difficult to get them to talk about their experience because of these cultural factors or norms that this is not something that we talk about. So it's just important, again, to remember, meet somebody where they are and help them to understand why it's important and acknowledge, I know this is probably really uncomfortable for you to talk about, so let me explain why we need to talk about that and why it's important for your case. So I just want to provide a couple additional resources that come from the psychological world. So the American Psychological Association has a great report they put together called Working with Immigrant Origin Clients. And it tends to be, of course, more mental health and counseling oriented, but there's some great commentary in there and suggestions in terms of how to work with people coming from some of these different experiences. And then there's another article called When Immigration is Trauma. And so just, again, trying to understand various aspects of an immigrant experience that can then factor into the work that you all are doing. So I just want to thank you for the work you're doing. You really are changing lives and trying to help people take back aspects of their lives and gain control if that was taken away from them. So I really commend you and appreciate all the work that you're doing, and I'm happy to be here to help.
Great. Thanks, Dr. Zelahusky. We'll pause just for a minute to see if folks have any questions about that portion of the training. I'm hoping to sort of dial it in and provide some tips and more practical tips anyway about how to translate some of this information into what you can do with the clients you're working with. So, okay. Let's see. So, given all of that information that Dr. Zelahusky provided us, the goal is to provide trauma-informed services, and these are just some of the sort of mantras that I tend to repeat when I'm explaining to folks what that means. So focusing on understanding the whole individual in the context of their life experience. You might be working on one discrete issue, one discrete piece of legal relief, but these clients, all of our clients have a very full life experience, and all of those experiences affect the way that they engage with you. Providing culturally competent and sensitive services, minimizing sort of re-traumatization through our advocacy for the client, creating an environment that's hospitable and engaging for survivors so that they can engage in the legal process. The two I want to focus on is forming a relationship based in partnership with the survivor in order to minimize the power imbalances that often arise in the lawyer-client relationship, and focusing on trust and safety. So the one thing I really want to hammer home about working with survivors of trauma is that building rapport is key. Although we as legal professionals inherently trust one another because it's a self-regulating and self-policing profession and we're in positions of confidence, that's not necessarily the perspective that our clients are coming from, and we need to earn their trust over whatever period of time that might be. And I think there's a few things that Dr. Zelahusky touched on that can aid in that. And one is being clear about your role in the process, the client's role in the process, and also your expectations for the client. You want them to engage and be an active part of this case. You are not holding their hand, so to speak, throughout the whole process. You're providing them information so that they can engage and help you advocate for them. Giving information transparently and not making promises you can't keep. Even if you've never worked on an asylum case before, you don't have to have all of the answers. It's okay to say, I don't have the answer to this question right now, but I'm going to check with someone and I will get back to you about, you know, whatever the proper advice is, and explaining why certain things are happening, why you're asking certain questions, why people are participating in the interview. And also being predictable. I really want to echo that. I think maintaining structures and routine and preparing clients for meetings and changes. Who's going to be present at the meeting? What are they going to be doing? What will we accomplish in this meeting? What do you need to bring? Will there be an interpreter, etc.? I think it's also important to understand the reasons why a survivor might not easily engage in the legal process and to not take it personally, to understand that the behavior that may make them unable to engage at this point in time, or that may make you, for example, doubt their credibility, is often directly related to the trauma that this person has suffered. A few examples would be that I hear and that I feel frequently. Why isn't my client ever called me back? Why are they always late to appointments? Why are they always canceling meetings? And sometimes it's as simple as asking, what's going on. Sometimes, clients don't want to tell their story. It's shameful. It's embarrassing. They physiologically may re-experience the trauma that they suffered. And I was talking to a colleague here who mentioned that she asked the client why she was late to an appointment, and she asked, is it because you didn't want to talk about the trauma? And the client said yes. So sometimes just engaging with the client and figuring out what is going on. Another one that I think about is, why won't she tell me the whole story? Why can't she tell me in order? It's strange that she doesn't seem to remember certain details about, this very serious trauma that she underwent. But I think it's important to think about the impact of trauma on the way clients relay stories to us. They're often very episodic. You're going to get pieces of the story at the time and not the whole story from beginning to end in chronology. I think it's particularly challenging for clients who have dealt with chronic trauma because it's not a single traumatic event. It's easier to ask questions about the first incident of abuse or trauma. What was the worst incident? And what was the last time that you underwent this trauma or this abuse? To prompt that episodic memory, but to also get the information that you need for affidavits. I think sticking to the who, what, when, where, why doesn't really help in those situations versus, can you describe what happened during that situation? Can you tell me about the next thing that you remember happening? And I think for me, I end up taking a lot of notes, going back, sort of reorganizing them, and then thinking about how to structure my next client meeting. The other issue is changes in stories, so not confusing omissions or inconsistencies with untrue statements or false reports. I think our clients don't know what's relevant until they know what's relevant, and we tell them that it's relevant. We had a client come in to file a U-Visa application because she had been the victim of an armed robbery last year, and we prepared the entire application, and it wasn't until the end stages that she told us about this horrible sex trafficking situation that she had been in her teens and 20s, but it just, to her, did not seem relevant to the discrete legal requirements of this other form of relief that she was applying for. And it may seem like she was hiding the ball on something, but really that was an omission. She didn't understand that it was relevant. So I think part of that also plays into creating a safe space, both emotionally and physically. I know that for us, we work in office environments all the time. We're used to sort of whatever space that we might work in, but our clients aren't necessarily familiar with those spaces. So asking them, do you want the door open? Do you want the door closed? Where do you want to seat? Being mindful maybe of the seating arrangements and not having your computer between you and your client, maybe taking notes by hand. I know not all of these are practical or even possible in the spaces that we work in, but I think giving our clients control over that space is very helpful. I think also when we think about space, we should think about who is in this room, who needs to be in this room when I'm talking to the client. And I think it seems oversimplistic, but really no one else should be in the room but your client. I think asking clients, for example, if they're comfortable having someone in the room, whether it's a parent, a spouse, or a child, can create a difficult dynamic where they have to assert themselves in a way they might not want to in front of a person who might be engaging in some of the traumatization. So especially with parents and children, just saying, okay, mom, dad, guardian, I need you to step out. You know, in the past, this has created strange dynamics. For example, there was a situation where we were working with a teenage client, and her mom always came to the appointments, and it wasn't, you know, this was for a trafficking case, but it wasn't until a couple years later that we found out that she had been also the survivor of a horrible sexual assault by her uncle, who was her mom's brother, but she never told us about it because mom was always there. You know, those kinds of dynamics are subtle, but they do make a difference. Let me see, sorry. Oh, I think the other thing that plays into this is working with interpreters. I think thinking about the dynamics, whether it's gender or power or whatever it might be, when using interpreters. So for that one example with the teenage daughter and her mother, I was mindful, because her trafficker also happened to be an older woman, of not using interpreters that she felt uncomfortable being in the same room. I know that those kinds of things are harder to control, but I think if you're working with young women who are survivors of sexual assault, maybe considering who was the person, who was the perpetrator, who is in a position of confidence, who are they going to feel comfortable around. And again, this is based on resources. Sometimes the language, like you have an interpreter, this is who you have and you need to work with it, but if you're having a hard time getting your client to tell you your story, it might be time to evaluate the interpreter you're using or the space that you're using and just check in with the client to ask them what would make them more comfortable. And as far as emotional safety, I think one thing is that we're hearing some really traumatic stories on a day-to-day basis from your client. It's really hard to not become emotional, but I think it is important to keep your emotional reactions in check and to stay calm. I think it's important to model the coping strategies that we expect our clients to employ. You may want to, you know, reach around and give your client a hug or put your arm on their shoulder, but you need to make sure that you're not violating your client's physical space. You need to just check in with them and see what they need. I talked about interpreters. The other thing about interviewing, and I would refer you to our other training on implicit bias, which I think would help in this experiential interviewing, is to be aware of the language that you use and the kinds of questions that you ask. I mentioned already not to use sort of the who, what, where, when questions because they're not helpful, but to be mindful of the way you ask questions, because sometimes questions that express disbelief, even if it's unintentional, can reinforce the client's feelings of self-blame and create additional barriers to disclosure. So for example, asking, well, why didn't you call the police when that happened? Or why didn't you fight back? Can sometimes reinforce the way that the client is already feeling about that particular situation. Instead, I would suggest, can you describe what you were thinking, or tell me the next thing that happened to you, or were you able to express to someone what happened to you, sort of trying to put yourself in the client's shoes and understand the context of what was going on rather than asking fact-based, slightly judgmental questions. I think part of that is also repeating back to clients what you're hearing and asking them to explain what they were thinking, as opposed to cross-examining our clients, which I think is a tendency that we have as lawyers. So I will leave it at that. I could do an entire day's worth of tips of how to interview clients based on my own mistakes in the last 10 years, but I think these are some of the common ones that we can have control over when working with our clients. So if there's not any questions, I think that we will sign off for now to try to stick to our 45 minutes. But thank you, everyone, for participating in our webinar today. I've included my contact information if you have any follow-up questions or want to have any further discussions about trying to navigate and troubleshoot any difficult client relationships.